written in what is called verse libre. Let me translate it to you. It just means free verse. What does that mean? That stanzas do not have a fixed structure. It's not a quatrain, it's not a couplet, it's not a sestet, it's not a tercet. Look at it any way, but it seems as if Eliot writes in any way he pleases. The structure, the form of the poem is what you can call verse libre or free verse. What is the writer talking about? He's talking about his failure. He's talking about his failure. But his failure is actually representative of the futility of life in contemporary society. Throughout the poem, Eliot shows us how much he has read. The depth and breadth of his reading strikes you in every poem of his, because the allusions, my dear students, would need a great deal of reading. Maybe many times as we read the poem, we can only guess at the allusions. Maybe many times the allusions are there. Many times your teachers will help you understand the allusions. And many times we may have to go to critics of T.S. Eliot's poems in order to be able to understand what it is all about. For students who are interested in knowing more about Eliot, I would suggest that you should look at books like 20th Century Interpretations, where there is a collection of different critics, and you would come to know what the poem is all about. Throughout the poem, the symbolism that we come across is one of rain, as well as contrasted with drought. Rain as the life giver and drought as the life taker or the life killer, because during drought, nothing can grow. Remember, my dear students, we are not looking at only the natural phenomena of rain and drought. We are looking at the human being with his ability to produce. Produce what? I shall talk about it later. And also the inability to produce. What one in modern psychology talks about, the drying up. Suddenly there is a drying up, or it could be a gradual drying up, and the human being becomes incapable of writing anything, of producing anything. There is a sense of inevitable decay. I'm going to do the poem with you in detail, and therefore, please see on the screen the lines of the poem which I shall be explaining to you. Thou hast not youth nor age, but as it were an after-dinner sleep, dreaming of both. Can I have the slide, please? What we are looking at here is that there is only dreaming of both. What is this both? Both mind and body. Both the mind and the body, both mental action and physical action are not possible for Gerontion and for modern man. Thou hast, now this is from Measure for Measure by Shakespeare. This is the epigram before the actual poem begins. One wonders, is the poet speaking to Gerontion? Is Gerontion speaking to us? Is Gerontion speaking to listeners? No way in which we can make out. We have to guess, and it has to be a sensible guess. It has to be an intellectual guess. Probably it is the poet who is telling Gerontion that he is incapable of both physical and mental action. When Eliot was writing this poem, my dear students, actually he was lecturing on Elizabethan and Jacobean drama. And therefore, in the course of this poem, we see a great deal of reference to both the Elizabethan and the Jacobean plays and drama. Eliot did not take away from his teachings to sit and write. He did both simultaneously. Let's look at the next slide. Here I am, an old man in a dry month, being read to by a boy waiting for rain. My dear students, I mentioned to you that rain is anything that can produce life. So when you are probably wanting to take an examination, ideas must come to your mind so that you can write the answers, right? So in the same way, when there is a poet, he needs ideas. When you have to create something, if you are a scientist, you need ideas. So here, waiting for rain indicates the waiting for inspiration, the waiting for ability to be able to do something, to produce physically or mentally. What is it that Gerontion is talking about? He is now an old man. He is now incapable of action. But I want you to understand, my dear students, that according to Eliot, it is not as if Gerontion is incapable of action today because he is old. No. Gerontion was never capable of action. And now, as an old man, when he sits waiting for rain, he looks back at his life and realizes, even when he was physically fit, even when he was young, even when he was in the prime of his life, he was incapable of any action. I talked about the breadth and depth of Eliot's reading. So when he talks about hot gates, I was neither at the hot gates. What is he talking about? He's talking about a war, a Greek war in ancient Greece, takes us somewhere to 380 BC. But then he links it to his present. And what is his present? Eliot tried very hard to enlist as a soldier in the World War, but he was not accepted as a soldier. And therefore, Eliot is probably putting his experiences in the mouth of Gerontion when he says that he did not fight in the warm rain. What is it that the life of a soldier is like? Look at the words, my dear students. Nor fought in the warm rain, nor knee-deep in the salt marsh, heaving a cutlass, bitten by flies, fought. You know that the life of a soldier is not an easy life. And he could not do all this. He wanted to act, but he was incapable of action. Who? Gerontion, the persona, and the poet Eliot. Remember that the persona is different from the poet. This is not an autobiographical poem, but the poet obviously brings in some of his experiences into the poem. And then he says, my house is a decayed house. I mentioned to you even earlier that this concept of decay, barrenness, disintegration, nihilism almost is there in most of Eliot's poems. And the decayed house that he's talking about here is the human body. He believes that his body, Gerontion's body, modern contemporary man's body, is like a decayed house. Decay, my dear students, please remember, is a process of disintegration. It's not death. It's not destruction. I think these are better because these are probably sudden. But decay indicates a process of slow disintegration and ruin. And therefore, he talks of his house being a decayed house. And the Jew squats on the windowsill. The owner spawned in Estaminet of Antwerp, blistered in Brussels, patched and peeled in London. Antwerp, Brussels, London, my dear students, you know that these are important trading commercial centers in Europe. They were, and they still are. Antwerp, my dear students, you know, is the hub of diamond industry. And we in Gujarat certainly know about Antwerp. Now, he's talking about these trading centers. Why does he mention these cities? Probably because he is worried that the only power that is respected in the world today is the power of money. And therefore, he is mentioning these urban centers. He talks about the Jew squats on the windowsill because the Jews have been associated with money lending, with commerce, right from the days of Shakespeare, the Elizabethan age. Remember, for students of literature, all of us know of Shylock, the Jew, the money lender. He goes on, after talking about the commercial power of the world, to the situation, the psychological landscape today. What is it like? The goat coughs at night in the field overhead. Rocks, moss, stone crop, iron merds. The woman keeps the kitchen, makes tea, sneezes at evening, poking the peevish gutter. Look at these 4 lines, my dear students. There isn't one positive word. There isn't one bright word. There isn't one word to cheer us up. Because this is what Eliot believed was the condition of contemporary society. 20th century society, according to him, had a landscape of aridity and desolation, which comes across again and again in every poem of his. Let us look at the slide. What does he say? What does Gerontion say? I am an old man, a dull head among windy species. Signs are taken for wonders, we would see a sign. We are waiting. Hindus talk about the Dashavatara, and we talk about waiting for Kalki. So too does the Christian poet talk about waiting for a miracle. Will Christ come down again, or will he send us a sign? And therefore he says, we would see a sign. It is also a reference to man's innate questioning ability. No, I wouldn't even call it an ability. I would call it a fault, a defect. Even when the miracle is in front of you, you ask, is it true that it is a miracle? Is it true that this is God? Is it true that this is God's representative? This is what worries Eliot when he says that we do not want to accept. We would see a sign. We ask for a sign, a proof that it is a miracle, a proof that it is divinity speaking to us. I'll talk about it later when we talk about journey of the Magi. And therefore, he says in spring, we hope that we will see Christ again. In the juvenescence of the year, juvenescence is spring, came Christ the tiger. Tiger. All those pictures that you've seen of Christ, all those descriptions that you have seen of Christ, Christ is always calm, peaceful, with absolutely no indication of any anger in him. Why then is Christ being compared to the tiger? My dear students, do you remember Blake? Do you remember Blake's poems on the tiger, tiger, tiger burning bright? And then the poem on the lamb, where he talks about both the wrathful aspect as well as the calm, peaceful aspect of God. And here, Eliot is talking about the wrathful aspect. Because if Christ were to come down again, he cannot come in the form in which he came earlier. 20th century demands, needs, requires the wrath of God. And therefore, he talks of Christ as coming as the tiger. Some of you might recall Eliot's poem where he talks about the same thing, where he talks about slouching towards Bethlehem. It's the same idea that we find in the Irish poet W.B. Yeats. Let's continue with the poem, my dear students. It's a long poem, but I hope you are with me, understanding what Eliot is doing in this poem, pointing out to us the barrenness that is associated with 20th century in the mind of every thinking individual. And Eliot certainly was a thinking individual. We continue with the same idea of depraved May, dogwood, chestnut, flowering Judas. Judas, of course, you remember, is the one who gave away Christ when they were at the Last Supper. And then you've got names. You've got Mr. Silvero. You've got Limoges. You've got... What are all these names? He just takes random names. I don't think they refer to any particular character. They are just random names. But my dear students, I want you to understand. I want you to realize that all the names that he uses are urban names. Because this entire concept of barrenness, this entire concept of the world being a wasteland, this entire concept of disintegration and decay and depravity, all that in Eliot's mind, as in the minds of many 20th century writers, is associated with the concept of urban life. You go back to rural life, you can once again see beauty, simplicity, innocence, etc. All these that Eliot is writing about refer to the urban landscape. It is the urban landscape, and therefore the names that Eliot uses are all urban names. What are we looking for? We are looking for some sort of salvation. And where do we go for salvation? Maybe we go to the painters, maybe we go to the writers, and therefore when he talks about the Titians, he is talking about the paintings which were very popular in his days. He's talking about those. What is he like? An old man. Let me read the line before that. I have no ghosts, because I've not done anything. I have never acted. I've been incapable of action. So what ghosts can I have? Eliot surprisingly seems to suggest that it is better to commit a crime than not to act at all. Because if you've committed a crime, or if you've participated in the war, if you have killed enemy soldiers, probably the ghosts of those soldiers will come to haunt you in your old age. But then you didn't do anything. You were incapable of action. So how can you have any ghosts, because you've never acted even when you were young? And therefore Gerontion, the persona, says, I have no ghosts. And what am I like? An old man in a drafty house under a windy knob. And then he goes on with, after such knowledge. What is this knowledge? Is there any knowledge? Or is it a perversion of knowledge? He goes on with that. And the poem continues to have that dominant tone of menace and intrigue and horror and disintegration. The problem is, there is no thought, there is no action. Eliot is certain that you cannot have action without thought, you cannot have thought without action. It's a long poem, my dear students. Let's quickly reach the conclusion, where he talks about the tiger, he talks about death, and then tenants of the house, thoughts of a dry brain in a dry season. You'll have to go back and read the poem to see the kinds of figures of speech that he uses. If you notice in the second line on the screen, my dear students, chilled delirium is a wonderful example of an oxymoron, because delirium is when you have high fever, and that time the body should be hot. But here he's talking about chilled delirium. You have the oxymoron. You have all these proper names that are referred to. You have reference to Tennyson's Ulysses, who wanted to act, and you